Certainty. Certainty. The left hemisphere likes things that are man-made. Things we make are also more certain. We know them inside out, because we put them together. They are not, like living things, constantly changing and moving, beyond our grasp. Because the right hemisphere sees things as they are constantly new for it, so it has nothing like the databank of information about categories that the left hemisphere has. It cannot have the certainty of knowledge that comes from being able to fix things and isolate them. In order to remain true to what is, it does not form abstractions and categories that are based on abstraction, which are the strengths of denotative language. By contrast, the right hemisphere's interest in language lies in all the things that help to take it beyond the limiting effects of denotation to connotation. It acknowledges the importance of ambiguity. It therefore is virtually silent, relatively shifting and uncertain, where the left hemisphere, by contrast, may be unreasonably, even stubbornly, convinced of its own correctness. As John Cutting puts it, despite an astonishing degree of ignorance on the part of the left, supposed major hemisphere about what its partner, the right, supposed minor hemisphere, is up to, it abrogates decision-making to itself in the absence of any rational evidence as to what is going on. There are numerous examples of this phenomenon. A split-brain subject, to whose right hemisphere a photograph of a nude in a suggestive pose is projected, becomes flustered and laughs in an embarrassed fashion. When the experimenter asks her why, her verbal left hemisphere has no idea. She therefore makes something plausible up. Someone in the room is upsetting her. But a famous example, reported by Gazzaniga and Ledoux, illustrates the most important point here. The experimenters show a split-brain patient a picture projected to one or other hemisphere and asks him to pick a card connected with the scene. For example, they show a snow scene to the right hemisphere and ask him to choose an appropriate picture from an array of cards, with either hand. He cannot say what it is that he has seen, because the right hemisphere cannot speak, but he is able with his left hand to go straight to the picture of a shovel. However, since the left hemisphere did not see anything, his right hand chooses at random, and scores no better than chance. Then they make things a bit more interesting. At the same time that they flash a picture of the snow scene to the right hemisphere, they flash a picture of a chicken claw to the left hemisphere. Each hemisphere has knowledge of only one image, and in each case it is different. When they ask to choose an appropriate card, again his left hand chooses a shovel, because the right hemisphere has seen the snow, but the right hand chooses a picture of a chicken, because what the left hemisphere has seen is the chicken claw. When asked why his left hand had chosen the shovel, his verbal left hemisphere, which has to respond to the question, but knows nothing of the snow scene, the real reason for choosing the shovel, is not in the least abashed. He explains that he saw a chicken, and of course chose the shovel because you need that to clean out the chicken shed. The really interesting finding here, as the authors themselves put it, is that without batting an eye the left hemisphere draws mistaken conclusions from the information available to it and lays down the law about what only the right hemisphere can know. Yet, the left did not offer its suggestion in a guessing vein but rather as a statement of fact. This may be linked to a phenomenon known as confabulation, where the brain, not being able to recall something, rather than admit to a gap in its understanding, makes up something plausible, that appears consistent, to fill it. Thus, for example, in the presence of a right-sided lesion, the brain loses the contextual information that would help it make sense of experience. The left hemisphere, nothing loath, makes up a story, and, lacking insight, appears completely convinced by it. Even in the absence of amnesia, the left hemisphere exhibits a strong tendency to confabulate. It thinks it knows something, recognizes something, which it doesn't, a tendency that may be linked to its lack of ability to discriminate unique cases from the generalized categories into which it places them. The left hemisphere is the equivalent of the sort of person who, when asked for directions, prefers to make something up rather than admit to not knowing. This impression is confirmed by Panksepp. The linguistically proficient left hemisphere appears predisposed to repress negative emotions and even chooses to confabulate. To some extent, perhaps we inevitably confabulate stories about our lives, a process overseen by what Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere interpreter. However, it is the right hemisphere that makes judgments about the truth or plausibility of these narratives. The fact is that this habit is far from harmless. It leads the left hemisphere to make poor inferences and some mistaken choices. In one experiment by Gazzaniga's colleagues, split-brain subjects were asked to guess which color, red or green, was going to be displayed next, in a series where there were obviously 4 times more green than red. Instead of spotting that the way to get the highest score is to choose green every time, the right hemisphere's strategy, leading to a score of 80%, the left hemisphere chose green at random, but about 4 times more often than red, producing a score of little better than chance. The problem here, as subsequent research has illuminated, is that the left hemisphere develops a rule that is, however, wrong. In a similar, earlier experiment in normal subjects, researchers found that, not only does what we now know to be the left hemisphere tend to insist on its theory at the expense of getting things wrong, but it will later cheerfully insist that it got it right. In this experiment, the researchers flashed up lights with a similar frequency, 4 to 1, for a considerable period, and the participants again predicted at random in a ratio of 4 to 1, producing poor results. But after a while, unknown to the subjects, the experimenters changed the system, so that whichever light the subject predicted, that was the light that showed next. In other words, the subject was suddenly bound to get 100% right, because that was the way it was rigged. When asked to comment, the subjects, despite having carried on simply predicting the previously most frequent light 80% of the time, overwhelmingly responded that there was a fixed pattern to the light sequences and that they had finally cracked it. They went on to describe fanciful and elaborate systems that explained why they were always right. So the left hemisphere needs certainty and needs to be right. The right hemisphere makes it possible to hold several ambiguous possibilities in suspension together without premature closure on one outcome. The right prefrontal cortex is essential for dealing with incomplete information and has a critical role to play in reasoning about incompletely specified situations. The right hemisphere is able to maintain ambiguous mental representations in the face of a tendency to premature overinterpretation by the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere's tolerance of uncertainty is implied everywhere in its subtle ability to use metaphor, irony and humor, all of which depend on not prematurely resolving ambiguities. So, of course, does poetry, which relies on right hemisphere language capacities. Blurred or indistinct images are not a problem for the right hemisphere, but are for the left, even where the nature of the task would suggest that it should be more problematic for the right hemisphere. One of the most consistent early findings in hemisphere specialization was that whenever an image is either only fleetingly presented, or presented in a degraded form, so that only partial information is available, a right hemisphere superiority emerges, even when the material is verbal. In some subtle experimental work, Justine Sergent was able to demonstrate this and its converse, namely that when images are presented for longer than usual, thus increasing their certainty and familiarity, a left hemisphere superiority emerges, even when it comes to face recognition. She makes the interesting observation that letters of the alphabet represent a finite set of stimuli that are sharply focused, familiar and overlearned, whereas visual images represent a potentially infinite set of shapes of large visual angle size, with different levels of structure of unequal importance and salience that are most often unfamiliar to subjects. In doing so, she neatly reveals a common thread which unites, on the one hand, the left hemisphere's affinity for what it itself has made, here language, well-worn familiarity, certainty and definitive, and, on the other, the right hemisphere's affinity for all that is other, new, unknown, uncertain and unbounded. Again, what has to be referred to, in an account such as I am giving in this chapter, left hemisphere fashion, as separate functions, or areas of concern, should also be seen, right hemisphere fashion, as aspects of one and the same entity that are only artificially separated in the process of description. The functions are not arbitrarily housed together in this or that hemisphere, they form, in the case of either hemisphere, aspects of two whole ways of being in the world. Certainty is also related to narrowness, as though the more certain we become of something the less we see. To put this in the context of the neurophysiology of vision, the fovea of the human eye, a tiny region in the retina at the center of gaze, is the most pronounced of that of all primates. Here resolution is about 100 times that at the periphery. But it is only about 1 degree across. The part of the visual field that is actually brought into resolution is no more than about 3 degrees across. This is where the narrow focused beam of left hemisphere attention is concentrated, what is clearly seen. Self-awareness and emotional timber. The right hemisphere is also more realistic about how it stands in relation to the world at large, less grandiose, more self-aware than the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is ever optimistic, but unrealistic about its shortcomings. When patients who have had a right hemisphere stroke are offered constructive guidance about their performance, it makes little impact. In the words of one researcher into head injury, children with right brain deficit disorder ignore task obstacles, accept impossible challenges, make grossly inadequate efforts, and are stunned by the poor outcomes. These children act fearless because they overlook the dangers inherent in the situation. A highly intelligent professional described by Stuss was completely unaware of his lack of capacity to do his job after the removal of a tumor in the right prefrontal cortex. When asked to role-play as an occupational health advisor to someone with his problems, he appropriately advised medical retirement, but when asked to apply this insight to his own situation, he was completely unable to do so. There are many similar case reports. Although relatively speaking the right hemisphere takes a more pessimistic view of the self, it is also more realistic about it. There is evidence that those who are somewhat depressed are more realistic, including self-evaluation, and that depression is often a condition of relative hemisphere asymmetry, favoring the right hemisphere. Even schizophrenics have more insight into their condition in proportion to the degree that they have depressive symptoms. The evidence is that this is not because insight makes you depressed, but because being depressed gives you insight. Insight into illness generally is dependent on the right hemisphere, and those who have damage to the right hemisphere tend to deny their illness, the well-recognized and extraordinary phenomenon of anosognosia, in which patients deny or radically minimize the fact that they have, for example, a blatant loss of use of what may be one entire half of the body. A patient with a completely paralyzed left limb may pointedly refuse to accept that there is anything wrong with it, and will come up with the most preposterous explanations for why he is not actually able to move it on request. This happens to some degree in the majority of cases after a stroke affecting the left side of the body, involving right hemisphere damage, but practically never after a right-sided stroke, involving left hemisphere damage. The phenomenon of denial can be temporarily reversed by activating the affected right hemisphere. Equally, denial of illness, anosognosia, can be induced by anesthetizing the right hemisphere. Note that it is not just a blindness, a failure to see, it's a willful denial. Hoff and Pottsell describe a patient who demonstrates this beautifully. On examination, when she is shown her left hand in the right visual field, she looks away and says, "I don't see it." She spontaneously hides her left hand under the bedclothes or puts it behind her back. She never looks to the left, even when called from that side. If forced to confront the affected limb, there is not infrequently a sense of repulsion from it, known as misoplegia. If the examiner puts the patient's own left hand in her right hand, she takes hold of it only to drop it immediately with an expression of disgust. In right hemisphere lesions, there is not only denial or indifference in the face of incapacity, but sometimes a disturbance of mood reminiscent of the fatuousness of those with frontal lesions, euphoria, joviality, a penchant for feeble puns. One of the patients reported by Hekin and Ajuriagura, who had complete hemiosomodognosia caused by a parietal tumor, exhibited a surprising joviality, at the same time complaining of a fierce headache. Denial is a left hemisphere specialty, in states of relative right hemisphere inactivation, in which there is therefore a bias toward the left hemisphere. Subjects tend to evaluate themselves optimistically, view pictures more positively, and are more apt to stick to their existing point of view. In the presence of a right hemisphere stroke, the left hemisphere is crippled by naively optimistic forecasting of outcomes. It is always a winner. Winning is associated with activation of the left amygdala, losing with right amygdala activation. There are links here with the right hemisphere's tendency to melancholy. If there is a tendency for the right hemisphere to be more sorrowful and prone to depression, this can, in my view, be seen as related not only to being more in touch with what's going on, but more in touch with, and concerned for, others. No man is an island. It is the right hemisphere of the human brain that ensures that we feel part of the main. The more we are aware of and empathically connected to whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, the more we are likely to suffer. Sadness and empathy are highly correlated. This can be seen in studies of children and adolescents. There is also a direct correlation between sadness and empathy, on the one hand, and feelings of guilt, shame and responsibility, on the other. Psychopaths, who have no sense of guilt, shame or responsibility, have deficits in the right frontal lobe, particularly the right ventromedial and orbitofrontal cortex. Perhaps to feel at all is inevitably to suffer. The Greek word path, feeling, is related to pathos, an affliction, and to passion, to suffer. The same roots are in our word passion, and a similar development leads to the German word for passions, Leidenschaften, from the root leiden, to suffer. This is just one reason to doubt the easy equation between pleasure and happiness, on the one hand, and the good, on the other. Intrinsically caring for another essentially involves a certain disposition, the disposition to experience sorrow at the other's serious misfortune. To be just is to be disturbed by injustice, pain, suffering, and the loss of pleasure, then, sometimes constitute who we are and what we value. They are essentially woven into our deepest commitments. As reasons flow from our deepest commitments, we will sometimes have non-instrumental reason to suffer. Once, when Berlioz sobbed at a musical performance, a sympathetic onlooker remarked, "You seem to be greatly affected, monsieur. Had you not better retire for a while?" In response, Berlioz snapped, "Are you under the impression that I am here to enjoy myself?" When Lear cries, "Is there any cause in nature that makes these hard hearts?" we could reply, on one level, yes, a defect in the right prefrontal cortex. But that just illuminates the fact that cruelty does not exist in nature. Only humans with their left prefrontal cortex have the capacity for deliberate malice. But then only humans, with their right prefrontal cortex, are capable of compassion. Moral sense. Moral sense. Moral sense. Another area where analytic retrospection misleads us as to the nature of what we are seeing, since it reconstructs the world according to left hemisphere principles, is that of morality. Moral values are not something that we work out rationally on the principle of utility, or any other principle, for that matter. but are irreducible aspects of the phenomenal world, like color. I agree with Max Scheler, and for that matter with Wittgenstein, that moral value is a form of experience irreducible to any other kind, or accountable for on any other terms. And I believe this perception underlies Kant's derivation of God from the existence of moral values, rather than moral values from the existence of a God. Such values are linked to the capacity for empathy, not reasoning, and moral judgments are not deliberative, but unconscious and intuitive, deeply bound up with our emotional sensitivity to others. Empathy is intrinsic to morality. Patients with lesions in the ventromedial frontal lobes are impulsive, fail to foresee consequences and are emotionally disengaged from others, in particular the right ventromedial frontal cortex, which has rich interconnections with limbic structures, is critical to every aspect of moral and social behavior. Moral judgment involves a complex right hemisphere network, particularly the right ventromedial and orbitofrontal cortex, as well as the amygdala in both hemispheres. Damage in the right prefrontal cortex may lead to frank psychopathic behavior. Our sense of justice is underwritten by the right hemisphere, particularly by the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. With inactivation of this area, we act more selfishly. This is probably related to the right frontal lobe's capacity to see the other's point of view, and for empathy in general. I will discuss the relation between altruism and the right hemisphere in Chapter 4. The right frontal lobe's capacity to inhibit our natural impulse to selfishness means that it is also the area on which we most rely for self-control and the power to resist temptation. I think we can also make a connection here with a rather fundamental difference between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere stickiness, its tendency to recur to what it is familiar with, tends to reinforce whatever it is already doing. There is a reflexivity to the process, as if trapped in a hall of mirrors, it only discovers more of what it already knows, and it only does more of what it already is doing. The right hemisphere, by contrast, seeing more of the picture, and taking a broader perspective that characteristically includes both its own and the left hemispheres, is more reciprocally inclined, and more likely to espouse another point of view. One way of thinking of this is in terms of feedback systems. Most biological systems seek homeostasis. If they move too far in one direction, they stabilize themselves by self-correction. This is negative feedback, the most familiar example of which is the operation of a thermostat. If the temperature constantly tends to drop, the thermostat triggers a heating system that will act to bring the temperature back to the desired level. However, systems can become unstable and enter a situation in which positive feedback obtains, in other words, a move in one direction, rather than producing a move in the opposite direction, serves to promote further moves in the same direction, and a snowballing effect occurs. The right hemisphere, then, is capable of freeing us through negative feedback. The left hemisphere tends to positive feedback, and we can become stuck. This is not unlike the difference between the normal drinker and the addict. After a certain point, the normal drinker begins to feel less like another drink. What makes an addict is the lack of an off switch. Another drink only makes the next, and the next, more likely. And, interestingly enough, lesions of the frontal limbic systems, mainly in the right hemisphere, are associated with addictive behavior. Pathological gamblers, for example, have frontal deficits which are mainly right-sided. By contrast, in cocaine addicts, for example, stimulating the right prefrontal cortex reduces craving for cocaine. And denial, a left hemisphere specialty, is typical of addiction. The self. The self. The self. Conscious awareness of the self is a surprisingly late development in evolution. The higher apes, such as chimpanzees and orangutans, are capable of self-recognition, but monkeys are not. They fail the mirror test. The right prefrontal region is critically involved in self-recognition, whether by face or by voice. Imaging studies of self-recognition by face or voice confirm the importance of the right frontal region and the right cingulate cortex. An important correlate of self-awareness in humans is the correct use of the personal pronouns I and me, which is lacking in autism, a condition which replicates many right hemisphere deficits. Clearly, no one hemisphere can on its own constitute the self. The self is a complex concept, but, in brief, the self is intrinsically, empathically inseparable from the world in which it stands in relation to others, and the continuous sense of self are more dependent on the right hemisphere, whereas the objectified self, and the self as an expression of will, is generally more dependent on the left hemisphere. Some studies in split-brain subjects suggest a right hemisphere advantage for self-recognition, but others reveal that both hemispheres equally can recognize the self objectively, though the right hemisphere has an advantage for recognizing familiar others. The personal interior sense of the self with a history, and a personal and emotional memory, as well as what is, rather confusingly, sometimes called the self-concept, appears to be dependent to a very large extent on the right hemisphere. The self-concept is impaired by right hemisphere injury, wherever in the right hemisphere it may occur, but the right frontal region is of critical importance here. This could be described as self-experience. The right hemisphere seems more engaged by emotional, autobiographical memories. It is hardly surprising that the sense of self should be grounded in the right hemisphere, because the self originates in the interaction with the other, not as an entity in atomistic isolation. The sense of self emerges from the activity of the brain in interaction with other selves. The right orbitofrontal cortex, the part of the right frontal lobe most crucial for social and empathic understanding, is larger in primates than the left. It is likely that this part of the brain expands during the period of playful interaction between infant and mother in the second half of the first year, and the second year, of life, during which the sense of the self emerges. And indeed, the right orbitofrontal cortex is seen by Alan Shore as the crucible of the growing self. The right hemisphere matures earlier than the left, and is more involved than the left in almost every aspect of the development of mental functioning in early childhood, and of the self as a social, empathic being. Social development in the infant takes place independently of language development, another pointer to its right hemisphere origins. The relationship between the evolution of a sense of self and the sense of others as beings like oneself, and therefore as evoking empathy and understanding, which I have referred to before as an achievement of the right frontal lobes, is borne out by the dose relationship between the development of a sense of self and the development of theory of mind. This is, for example, evidenced by the fact that the neuroimaging correlates of both self-awareness and theory of mind lie in the right frontal and right cingulate cortex. It is also the right hemisphere which is responsible for maintaining a coherent, continuous and unified sense of self. Evidence from patients with dementia is highly suggestive that it is the right hemisphere that connects the individual to emotionally salient experiences and memories underlying self-schemas, and which therefore forms the glue holding together the sense of self. The remark is reminiscent of a formulation of Douglas Watts that emotion binds together virtually every type of information the brain can encode. It is part of the glue that holds the whole system together, and indeed, to the degree that that is true, the observation that the right hemisphere binds together the sense of self would follow from this, and as already implied in the brief discussion of the hemispheres and time, it is the right, prefrontal, cortex, in conjunction with its reciprocal connections with other cortical and subcortical structures, which enables human adults to see themselves as just that, selves, with continuous existence over time. Right frontal damage impairs the sense of self over time. Sperry and his colleagues hypothesize that it is a right hemisphere network that gives rise to self-awareness. The right hemisphere is preferentially involved in the processing of self-images, at least when self-images are not consciously perceived. In particular, A right frontoparietal network in the human brain seems critical for distinguishing the self from others. Activation in the right inferior and medial parietal region, namely the anterior precuneus and posterior cingulate cortex, is proportionate to the degree that stimuli are perceived as referring to the self. When subjects look at an image of their own face, activation is seen in the right hemisphere, especially at the right occipitotemporoparietal junction and in the right frontal operculum. Individuals may neglect or misidentify their own hands and feet when the right hemisphere, but not when the left hemisphere is damaged or temporarily inactivated. Asamedognosia, the condition in which subjects fail to recognize their embodied self or parts of their own body, is found in nearly 90% of subjects following any right hemisphere stroke, and, conversely, the condition appears to be associated only with right hemisphere deficits. Feinberg, who has made a study of the condition, notes that of the 100 cases known to him, not once has it followed left hemisphere damage. In keeping with this, those with damage to the right frontotemporal cortex may experience a cognitive detachment from self. When subjects read a first-person narrative, they activate the precuneus and anterior cingulate cortex bilaterally, but also preferentially the right temporoparietal junction, compared with reading a third-person narrative. Philosophers spend a good deal of time inspecting and analyzing processes that are usually, and perhaps must remain, implicit, unconscious, intuitive, in other words, examining the life of the right hemisphere from the standpoint of the left. It is perhaps then not surprising that the glue begins to disintegrate, and there is a nasty cracking noise as the otherwise normal robust sense of the self comes apart, possibly revealing more about the merits, or otherwise, of the process, than the self under scrutiny. Schizophrenics, like philosophers, have a problem with the sense of the self which ordinary individuals, involved with living, lack. As Wittgenstein once remarked, it's strange that in ordinary life we are not troubled by the feeling that the phenomenon is slipping away from us, the constant flux of appearance, but only when we philosophize. This indicates that what is in question here is an idea suggested by a misapplication of our language. Could this be read as the misapplication of language, in other words, the faulty procedure of seeking truth by standing in the world of the left hemisphere while looking at the world of the right? One recent elegant experiment underlines the key role played by the right hemisphere in the recognition of the self, and at the same time emphasizes the left hemisphere's affinity with public, rather than personal, knowledge. Using the WADA test, each subject was shown a computer-generated picture of the subject's own face morphed with that of a person famous in public life. After the anesthetic wore off, the subjects were then shown the separate pictures of the famous person and of themselves, and were asked which more closely resembled the picture they had previously seen. Those who had viewed the picture with their right hemisphere chose the picture of themselves. Those who had viewed it with their left hemisphere chose the picture of the famous person. In this study 9 out of 10 cases conformed to this pattern. Although there is one chorotomy, split brain, case reported that appears to suggest the opposite, virtually all other evidence points to the key role of the right hemisphere in self-recognition. The right frontal region appears to be essential for the determination of self in other modalities, too, such as voice recognition. Damage to the right parietal and medial regions may result in confusions of self with other. Damage to the right frontal lobe creates a disturbance of ego boundaries, suggesting that the right hemisphere, particularly the right frontal region, under normal circumstances plays a crucial role in establishing the appropriate relationship between the self and the world. It is this region that is so obviously not functioning properly in schizophrenia, where subjects not only lack empathy, humor, metaphorical understanding, pragmatics, social skills and theory of mind, but crucially mistake the boundaries of self and other, even at times feeling themselves to melt into other individuals or that other beings are invading or occupying their own body space. Important aspects of self-awareness in the sense of how we are likely to see more come across to others, akin to insight, also depend on the right hemisphere. The capacity to understand oneself as a human being like others, which is involved in self-awareness, is an aspect of the human ability to identify with others, empathize with them and share their feelings, dependent as we have seen, on the right hemisphere. The right inferior parietal lobule plays a crucial role both in planning and monitoring the outcomes of one's own actions. It was one of the earliest perceptions that the left hemisphere is the seat of conscious self-awareness, certainly for the expression of its selfhood through the conscious will. I have already suggested that the expression of the will, in the sense of the conscious, rational will, grasping and manipulating, may have been responsible for the expansion of the left hemisphere. Nonetheless, it turns out that when we are acting for ourselves, in the sense of initiating new action rather than following another's lead, the activity is largely in the right hemisphere, though this may be restricted to practical, habitual actions. There is a tendency for independence and motivation to be associated with the right hemisphere, and passivity with the left hemisphere. This is related to its stickiness, described above, its relative inability to shift set, espouse a new way of looking at things, rather than get locked into environmental cues. Environmental dependency syndrome refers to an inability to inhibit automatic responses to environmental cues. It is also known as forced utilization behavior. Individuals displaying such behavior will, for example, pick up a pair of glasses that are not their own and put them on, just because they are lying on the table, involuntarily pick up a pen and paper and start writing, or passively copy the behavior of the examiner without being asked to, even picking up a stethoscope and pretending to use it. According to Kenneth Heilman, the syndrome, as well as abulia, loss of will, akinesia, failure to move, and impersistence, inability to carry through an action, are all common after right, rather than left, frontal damage. In 4 out of the 5 cases of environmental dependency in Lermite Classic paper in which the syndrome was first described, the only or principal lesion was in the right frontal lobe. In each case the patient explained that you held out objects to me, I thought I had to use them. However, the situation is far from straightforward, since my reading of further data provided by Lermite is that the syndrome is as common after lesions in either frontal lobe, and a lesion in either frontal lobe may, in any case, release behavioral patterns characteristic of the posterior hemisphere on the same side, as much as impair the functioning of the hemisphere as a whole, or indeed the contralateral hemisphere via the corpus callosum. But it would be in keeping with other research that shows forced utilization behavior after right hemisphere damage. One patient not only showed exaggerated responses to external cues, utilization behavior, and motor impersistence, but a right-handed instinctive grasp reaction after an infarct in the right thalamus, which was associated with underperfusion of the entire right cerebral cortex, especially the frontal area. In reality, we are a composite of the two hemispheres, and despite the interesting results of experiments designed artificially to separate their functioning, they work together most of the time at the everyday level. But that does not at all exclude that they may have radically different agendas, and over long time periods and large numbers of individuals it becomes apparent that they each instantiate a way of being in the world that is at conflict with the other. Coda. The front-back problem. I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter that there was one intrahemispheric rather than interhemispheric regional difference that I needed to refer to. This involves the relationship of the frontal lobes, the most highly evolved and most distinctively human of all regions of the brain, with the processes going on elsewhere in the brain, including the posterior cortex, which they exist to exert control over. The frontal lobes achieve what they achieve largely through what is normally described as inhibition of the posterior part of the same hemisphere. It might be better described, however, especially in the case of the right hemisphere, as modulation. The inhibitory effect is significantly more pronounced in the case of the left hemisphere, perhaps in keeping with its less integrated, more black and white style. This relationship between front and back is another example of paired opponent processors enabling fine modulation of response. What do I mean by modulation? A process that resists, but does not negate. It is best thought of as the imposition of necessary distance, or delay, enabling something new to come forward. In this way it is like the apparently antagonistic relationship of the two hemispheres, a topic which I will explore at length later in the book, neither that the products of one hemisphere negate the products of the other, nor that in some bland sense they merely complement one another. Their incompatibility permits instead, in a dialectical synthesis, something new to arise. To take an example, if the right hemisphere's immediacy of association with emotion and the body leads it to prioritize what is close, what is mine, the right frontal lobe brings distance and delay to espousing my position. As a result, it enables others to stand forth as individuals like me. It enables a broader empathy and the beginnings of altruism. This is not a negation of something by the frontal lobe, but a modulation of it, an unpacking, if you like, of something that was there all along, albeit in germ only, something that comes to life only when a degree of necessary distance is interposed. Or to take another example, this time from the left hemisphere, the relative detachment from the body displayed by the left hemisphere, and its tendency to abstraction, normally serve its purposeful striving towards individual gain. The left frontal lobe, however, brings distance, and allows the experience of the peaceful detachment from the material realm and emptying out described by experts in meditation as a mystical experience. Again, this is no negation, but an elaboration of what the left hemisphere affords. There is not likely to be a God spot in the brain, and the area is fraught with problems of terminology and methodology, but there are areas that are often implicated as accompaniments of religious experience. An appropriately cautious and objective review of the literature to date by Michael Trimble concludes that there is a slow accumulation of evidence in favor of religious experience being more closely linked with the non-dominant hemisphere, especially the posterior right hemisphere.